Welcome, I'm Darren, and I'll be your guide today as I look at the Sportflics card sets of the 1980s, which spanned from 1986 all the way through 1990, and most card collectors don't know that these cards ever existed. In fact, even if you started late in the junk wax era, 1990-91, you might never have run into these and not known about them in the entire 35 years that you've been collecting. The cards were kind of like a novelty. They were never really truly classified as true cards, only that was late in the game. Early on it was very different. And if you're to ask a card collecting expert, what was the first premium card set ever created? You're almost always going to hear the response of 1989 Upper Deck. Good answer, but actually not correct. Because in 1986, when Sportflics was launched, well, let's do the math. So in 1986, a pack of cards was, 35, 40 cents, about that. 15 cards per pack. Sportflics had 3 cards per pack, just 3. So 15 cards to 3 cards, well, a 40-cent pack of 15 cards, that means that Sportflics should be 8 cents, but obviously they weren't. That's the thing. A pack of Sportflics wasn't necessarily the same price as the rest of the cards, but they were still very expensive. Each one of those cards cost a lot, and it was asking a lot for collectors to buy a pack that only had 3 cards in it. Now, fortunately, the card set was only 200 cards, so it was not a big card set, whereas the other brands had 600 to 792 cards, which meant that collecting a complete set of Topps, collecting a complete set of Sportflics, you didn't have to buy that many more packs of Sportflics to complete it, but still, bang for your buck, well, Sportflics was demanding a lot. You needed to make sure that the cards coming out of those packs were pretty star heavy, and Sportflics did do that. But I'm getting way ahead of myself. The key is that Sportflics was never really fully appreciated as a card brand. Early on, it was kind of accepted, but later on, it fell away. But the fact is, these were expensive card sets, and they really were mainstream card sets for at least a couple of years. So the cards themselves are lenticular cards, and that means that you have a plastic surface on the card with a bunch of ridges, and each one of those ridges is not a straightforward pyramid, it's actually slightly curved. And the curvature of the plastic means that when you look through it, where you see on the card changes, and so they have little pieces, little strips of image that are laced in there, kind of like an old scanline TV set. And so as you move your eyes, you're seeing different little bands of image, and so those images seem to change around. So as you move the card around, you're seeing different images appear because through the plastic it changes. It's an interesting technology that dates actually back to the 1920s. It's not new. But for card collecting, in the 1980s, we were well familiar with these because in the 1970s, a company called Xerography made these cards for Kellogg's. And the Xerography cards were really fine quality cards where you had like motion in them. But in the 1980s, the torch was passed over to a company called Optographics. And Optographics was a company that wanted to approach it, I don't know if it was like cheaper or how they wanted to, what their mindset was for making their cards. But the cards that Optographics made were very different from what we saw from Xerography. And Optographics, unlike Xerography, who just wanted to make something for somebody else, Optographics actually wanted to get into the baseball card market, and so they created a card set, or they made a card brand, not called Optographics, but called Sportflics, that could get major league licensing so that they could make a regular card set of baseball cards, which allowed them to solve a problem in baseball cards that kind of vexed everybody, which is that on the back of the cards made in the 1980s, you could not print an image. Fleer did try. In 1984, Fleer created a card where on the card back, they printed a black and white image that was so terrible, we basically saw nothing else throughout the entire 1980s. It wasn't until 1990 that Fleer actually got serious about putting images on the card backs. And after that, it took Topps and Don Russ until 1992 to bother to do it. So the fact that you couldn't put a portrait on the card back meant that the portrait had to be on the card front, so it limited your ability to have good action shots. So Sportflics had a 3-phase image. Instead of doing 3D motion, which is what most of the xerography, or maybe all of the xerography cards were designed as, here they wanted to have 3 images so you could flip between a portrait, an action shot, and another action shot. And this gave you room for a big portrait and big action shots. Now, unfortunately, the way that the cards actually are realized is most of the time you're seeing between 2 images. So it's rarely very clear, which means these cards do not work well in presentations. They don't work well in binders. And trust me, I put my 86 set and my 87 set in binders, and I pulled them out of the binders, and the plastic was so damaged I had to just throw them away. But I just didn't want to waste the binder space because they look terrible. First off, the images don't read. But the other thing you'll notice about this card is that on the card front, there is no design whatsoever. Just a white border around the outside. They don't have any other border elements, any design features. They don't even have the player's name. You got to look on the back to see who the player is. And the card back is pretty impressive. It's a very nice clean white with a couple of different colors which they come through extremely well. It's well manufactured. But the card set really doesn't have any intrinsic value that makes it really alluring. This is a card you have to want to get, and that's why it's considered a novelty. But that doesn't mean that the card set is just a simple, straightforward affair of a bunch of veteran cards. They do have subsets. It's just that the subsets don't look like subsets. Because you have the ability to have 3 different images on the card, well, that means you can put 3 different players on the card. That's not unique to this card brand because, Fleer and Don Russ were doing that with prospects, stuff like that. But here you got to have really clear photos or portraits of each of the 3 players, so you could have like league leaders. You could do that kind of thing with the TriStar cards. But they also had a subset called the Big Six, where they put a band in the middle, so you have a horizontal on the top, horizontal on the bottom. You can fit 6 different players onto each card. And this is really great because if you're collecting Pete Rose or Bell or Mookie Wilson or Cal Ripken Jr., whoever you're collecting, that allows them to get more of your player into those cards, which means that when you're buying those expensive packs, there's a better chance for you to pull a card that you want, especially if you're a team collector. They show up all over in the packs. So they did a really good job packing a lot of players into the set. And not only that, they also had a card looking at the World Series champions where they made 4 panels, which allowed them to get 12 different players onto the card. But again, the cards themselves aren't all that interesting. Now, for packs, they didn't just have 3 cards because they also put trivia cards in, which most people would recognize for Score years later, which is from the same company. But in Sportflics in 1986, they had the same trivia cards, but the way that the trivia cards for the 86 set were done is that the front is a flip between 2 different images, one being the logo for the trivia, the other being the trivia question right on the front. So on the back is where they have the answer, and then they have a whole separate little interesting fact write-up that doesn't even pertain to the question. And that's what they did. So for the packs, this is the only thing that they had in the packs were the main set and the trivia cards, but they also had some vouchers that showed up, which was to allow you to purchase a disc. This is a 4.5-inch disc, and it is a multi-image on the front. On the back, there is nothing but white. But this isn't the only thing they did for discs. Actually, Sportflics got into doing a couple of different kinds of discs. In 1987, they had inserts that allowed you to get 4 cards. And there are 4 different vouchers for 4 different cards, which means it's a 16 disc set. All of these do have numbers on the back. They have the whole write-up on the back. But the set is an 18 card set, and I don't know, or 18 disc set, and I don't know why it's 18 versus 16, how that worked. But this isn't the only thing, because they also have discs that have a big Sportflics logo on the back. At the end of the day, what I've got to say about this is the reason I've been waiting so long to do this video is because I've been trying to learn how these work, and I really don't know. I know some of the things about the discs, but there are a lot of discs out there. Some of them are collectible in set, some of them are not. It's really kind of crazy. But They did do these discs for quite a while, and this was something that they had a lot of fun with, but this was all send-away stuff, or I think it was all send-away stuff. Again, I don't entirely know, but I wanted to get this out of the way because I want to spend the rest of the time talking about just the cards themselves. And in the mid 1980s, every single card brand was selling specialty sets, whether it was in a complete set form or in special packs, or however they approached it. Sportflics was no different, and they had 2 sets that they sold as a complete set. One of them was Decade Greats, and this is looking at legendary players from throughout the years, basically the best players from each decade. And this was kind of special because we didn't have hardly any main release cards that looked at legends. Obviously, Donruss had their puzzles, Topps had their turning back the clocks, but apart from that, you really didn't have much in terms of classic legendary players. Secondary and tertiary card companies, they were creating cards of various legends. And then, of course, with Kmart and Woolworths, we were getting cards from legends there. But for a main release company, this was pretty much unheard of. So this gave modern collectors the ability to learn about players from the past and really kind of see how the past was built. Cool idea. But they also had a set for rookies, which again, this was something the other companies were doing. And so they had this card set for rookies where you might notice that the card looks a bit different. And the reason for that is this is kind of like a preview for the upcoming year. Here they have a blue inner border inside of the outer border, which adds a little bit of interest. But on the card back, you'll notice this has a full color image. And this is the first time we had a full color image on the back of a card. We normally attribute it to 1988 score because for a regular card, 88 score was the first case. But back here in 1986, they did do it on these rookie cards. So the rookie cards here are very, very, very innovative. Which leads me to 1987, and you will not be shocked to discover that 87 is the same design, except they have red for the inner border, but the back is oriented differently. So here, the whole card back is done in a way that reads in the horizontal format allows the distribution of information to look more like what we would get used to in the early 90s. Again, they have the color image on the card back, but a note about the color theming on this. The American League and the National League have different color themes on the backs of these cards. So depending on which league you have, the card color will shift on the back for what it's worth. Now, once again, this was not the most complex card set in the world, and so they do have the Tri-Stars, and they also have the Big Six for their insert set, or their subset cards. Nothing else beyond that. They didn't even bother to do the World Series card, so it's pretty much just straightforward. But they did do something different for their trivia cards, which is that the trivia cards actually are not trivia cards. They're team statistic cards. So every team has a whole bunch of these little trivia-like cards, but on the back, it breaks down different information about the team, which is a really good idea. And I don't know why we haven't had very many cards that are built around teams that have come out in years later. We've had a few here and there, but here they used these little tiles to just flood us with information about the team, which I think was a great move. But speaking of which, they had some preview panels for 1987, and these are 4 cards. This is not an uncut sheet. This is actually designed proportionally to fit together as a panel. There are 4 different panels, and they have 4 different players on each. So there are 16 players that show up across all the 4 panels. But each one of these panels also has a corresponding team information panel. So they come in pairs. So you can actually collect the whole 16 panel set if you care to. And they also had team preview cards. And the team preview cards are really kind of interesting. So in the case of the team preview cards, this is 4 images on each card on the front. So that means there are 12 images that show up. And then on the back, it has a whole write-up of what we were basically going to be seeing from the roster of the upcoming team. So kind of interesting, but I don't know how these cards came, because there are 26 of these, 1 for each team. And there's also a mini information card that goes along with each one of these. So they come in pairs. So they're, 52, is that right? Yeah, 52 of these total between them, but I don't know if they were distributed individually or as an entire set. I haven't quite figured that out, but at any rate, they do have this, but they also did do a special release set for the rookies, and here, like in the previous year, they're doing a preview of the upcoming set. Here you can see that the design is actually, there's a design on it. I mean, it's a 1970s design, but still, they do have a design on the front, which is a nice upgrade. But on the back, look at the size of that image. That is a really, really impressive image. Takes up a huge amount of space. But not only is the image really impressive, but you might notice that the whole card back is a single color of red, which makes these cards look really, really cool. And they're really leaning into the opportunities that they have with their printing technology, which should prompt me to mention before I go on to the 88 set that in 1988, Sportflics, the company, Optographics, the company that made Sportflics, also made a new set called Score, which was designed more like a normal card. So in 1988, there was both Score and Sportflics doing something very similar. And they were basically competition for one another, but Sportflics had already shown that it really wasn't going to be working as a main release card, so Score was created to fulfill that role. But Sportflics trivia cards would show up in all of the packs for quite a few years, so it would continue as kind of a dual release in a way. So in 1988, for the Sportflics set itself, the design is exactly the same as we saw with the rookie cards on the front, but not on the back. The back, it does have quite a bit of a difference, mainly because, well, it has a white card back as opposed to the solid colored card that we saw in the previous year. Now here, this is a card back that is trying to look more like Score, not like it's supposed to be associated with Score, but the lessons that they were learning were being used in both Score and Sportflics. The Sportflics card back is a lot more impressive than Score because of the amount of real estate that they had for the image on the back, but still, same idea. And the card set does have TriStar cards once again, but here it's just a couple cards tucked into the back. This is really getting toned down. Sportflics is now getting more streamlined and just is operating as the novelty set that it really always was. They also didn't bother to do a rookies card set. Instead, they did a game winners card set, which is more of a star-studded affair, where they wanted to emphasize the images themselves and really put them forward with a much more intricate design on the front, but on the back, the image is really front and center, which leads me to the 1989 design, where we'll start with the back, and you'll notice that, well, the back for 1989 Sportflics is leaning more heavily into a big image and leaning away from being a normal card, so they have very little information on the back because, look, at this point they knew they're a novelty set, and that's just the way that they were going to be rolling. But the front of the card is getting a lot more intricate, not in terms of the detail as much as now it's becoming an interactive affair. There was a little of that in 1988, but in 1989, now they have multiple colors flashing back and forth. You can actually get kind of a run of color moving through it, so there's motion within the motion. The card is getting to be a lot more fun, but on the card back, you might notice that it's difficult to read the card back here, and that's because of the color theme, which is very important with these cards because in '88, Score was released with different color themes throughout the set. So depending on where in the number sequence a player showed up, his card had one color sequence or another, and it just broke up the set. Well, in 1989, they did that with Sportflics as well, but not for the same reason. So here on the front and on the back, there is a color pairing, 3 different color pairings. There is the green and yellow, there's also orange and purple, and then there's red and blue. And again, these are not parallels, that's just the nature of the particular colors that happen to line up for each one of these players. But the whole card set does have that variety of all of these different card backs. And, well, the card fronts also have the color theme, but it's harder to tell the difference on the front. But it was baked into it, so now Score is influencing Sportflics as opposed to Sportflics influencing Score, for whatever that means. And they did do TriStars once again for 1989, but this was the last time they would bother with TriStars. So from here on out, which isn't for very much of a time, it would only be just the regular cards. But the trivia cards here are now tribute cards looking at legendary players with a whole little write-up. They didn't bother to do images, they just have the write-up about the player on the card back, so they're kind of harkening back to the decade greats with that. Which brings us to 1990. 1990 was the swan song for Sportflics. I'll get to into that for a second, but do understand as you look at these cards, this is the last that we'd see, at least of this phase. The cards for 1990 were now built with a lot of motion and intricacy built into it, which makes these cards a lot more energetic and a lot more fun. The cards also have the color theming that we saw in the previous year, but in this case, the whole card back is bathed in the color, so this really looks like the score. Although the colors may not line up in the same way because you have purple and you have green and you have blue, so the different colors are a bit different. And that was, well, okay, that's all there is to say about the card set, but I will say that for the trivia cards here, these cards do have the same card backs as in the main set, so they actually line up in terms of just the theming between them. Not that there's a parallel between them, but they did both. But that does bring Sportflics to a close, at least for the 1980s. There was no place for Sportflics at this point. By 1989, card companies were already waning on these whole specialty card sets because there was too much to buy. And so by 1990, even a novelty set like this, you already had Upper Deck and Bowman and Leaf that hit the baseball card market that was flooding it. So there was nowhere else to go with this card set. But it wouldn't be the only thing they would do with Sportflics, because it would come back years later after the Pinnacle playoff split. And we would see it for a couple of years in the mid-90s, which I'll look at separately, but it's like a whole different concept, a whole different approach. But for the 1980s, this was an interesting card set that was both boring and really unique in its quirky little way. So if you do have any questions about this, definitely ask me, because there's not a ton to know about it, but it is a very underappreciated, under-discussed card set. So I absolutely understand if you have any questions. And if you do have memories of these from the 1980s, I'm really curious to hear this, because by the time I started collecting, this was over. So this was something I discovered years later. But do look out for the 1994 through 96 Sportflics set, which I'll be doing at a later date. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. And yeah, thank you very much for watching.